Frank Miller, an aging Vietnam veteran, was mocked and dismissed when he tried to share the story of a mission that had been wiped from the records. The truth had been buried by officials who chose silence over accountability, leaving his comrades erased from history. But when a young journalist uncovered proof that the operation really happened, everything changed. Just wait until you hear how this forgotten soldier finally turned the tables and why justice at last prevailed. Frank Miller was 80 years old, though the lines on his face carried far more than 8 decades of life. In his small town in Ohio, he was a familiar figure, the man with the heavy step, the long white beard, and a voice that often rose a little too loud when the talk at the diner turned to politics or the state of the country. To strangers, he was just another retiree with strong opinions. To neighbors, he was the quiet widower who walked alone every evening, shoulders stooped, a veteran who kept to himself. What few knew was that Frank's silence carried weight. His memories were not the simple tales of an old man yearning for attention. They were fragments of nights in dense jungles, of names and faces of men who never came home, of operations carried out in shadows and then buried in silence. He had carried these memories for decades, hoping that one day they would be acknowledged. One evening, Frank decided to share them. The local Veterans Association was holding a meeting in the town hall, a place where flags lined the walls and medals gleamed proudly on jackets. Men and women of different ages filled the seats, swapping stories and shaking hands. It seemed like the right moment for Frank to finally speak, not for glory, not for applause, but to make sure the sacrifices of those forgotten were remembered. He stood, his hands trembling just slightly as he gripped the back of a chair for balance. His voice cracked at first, but then steadied. "I want to tell you about a mission," he began. "One that doesn't appear in the books. We were sent deep into the jungle. The orders were clear, but the records, they're gone, wiped away. And the men I served with." He was cut short. A voice from across the room called out, half joking, half dismissing, "Frank, spare us the tall tales. We've got real soldiers here, not ghost stories." A ripple of laughter followed. Younger veterans smirked, exchanging glances as though they'd just watched a child make up a game. Older members shook their heads in quiet disbelief, their patience worn thin. To them, Frank wasn't a veteran carrying hidden scars. He was just another old man chasing shadows of his past. The room grew restless. Some turned away. Others whispered under their breath. Frank stood there, the weight of their judgment pressing down harder than the cane he leaned on. His words hung in the air, unacknowledged, unwanted. In that moment, the dismissal was sharper than any wound he had carried home from war. He had been ready to speak of comrades who had given everything, of missions that had cost lives, of truths erased by silence. Instead, he was met with ridicule. To the audience, this moment sparks outrage. Here was a man who had given his youth to service, only to be erased twice. First by official records, and now by the very community that should have stood beside him. Frank sat back down quietly, his story unfinished. Around him, the chatter resumed as though nothing had happened, but inside, the fire of being unheard began to burn. Frank left the Veterans Hall that night, with his shoulders bent a little lower than usual. The laughter and whispers still echoed in his mind as he stepped into the cool evening air. The streets of his small town were quiet, the storefronts dark, the neon sign of the diner buzzing faintly in the distance. Each footstep on the pavement felt heavier than the last, as if every glance of doubt and every smirk he had endured back in that hall had left a weight pressing down on him. He walked alone, as he so often did. His wife, Margaret, had passed away years ago, and the house that had once been filled with her warmth now stood silent. Their son lived in another state, and though Frank tried to keep in touch, their conversations had grown short, strained, reduced to polite exchanges during holidays. In that silence, the echoes of the past became louder. But now, even that past, the years that had defined him, the service that had once given his life purpose, was being stripped away, to be told in front of others that his memories were nothing but stories. It cut deeper than anyone in that room could have understood. When he reached his front porch, Frank paused, staring at the door as though it were a gate to another world. Inside waited not comfort, not companionship, but solitude. He opened it slowly, stepped in, and was met by the creak of old floorboards and the faint ticking of a clock that never seemed to stop reminding him of passing time. In the basement, tucked away behind boxes of winter clothes and tools, sat the only thing that kept him tethered to who he was, An old, battered wooden box. Its corners were worn, its surface scarred, but inside it held pieces of a life that no one could deny. Letters, faded photographs, and an old leather-bound diary he had carried during those months overseas. He sat on the basement steps, pulling the box closer, as though it were an anchor, keeping him from drifting away. He opened the diary and ran his fingers across the pages. The handwriting was shaky in places, hurried in others, but every entry carried weight, dates, coordinates, fragments of conversations scribbled in the dark. There were names, too. Men who had stood beside him, who had laughed with him, and who had never returned home. But there was one item he always held with a kind of reverence, a folded letter, its paper yellowed with age. It had been written by his closest friend, Captain James Hopkins, hours before the raid that would claim his life. The words were steady, filled with courage, and at the same time, a quiet sense of farewell. Frank unfolded it carefully, as he had done countless times before. Reading it brought James back, if only for a moment. His voice, his laughter, his unwavering loyalty. Yet, outside of Frank's memory and this fragile piece of paper, James no longer existed in the official story. The raid had been erased, and with it the men who had given everything. That realization weighed on Frank like a shadow. It wasn't just that his story was doubted, it was that his friends, his brothers, were slipping into oblivion, forgotten not by time, but by choice. Sitting there in the quiet basement, the letter in his hands, Frank felt the pain cut deeper than the scars he carried on his body. The world might see him as an old man clinging to the past, but to him, this box, these words and those memories were proof that he, and the men he served with, had lived, had mattered, and still deserved to be remembered. Frank never expected anyone to knock on his door. Days often passed without a single visitor, and when the doorbell rang one gray afternoon, he assumed it was a delivery or perhaps a neighbor in need of help. Instead, on the porch stood a young woman holding a leather satchel, her expression earnest, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Mr. Miller," she asked, "my name is Sarah Collins. I'm a journalist. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." Frank hesitated. Reporters weren't strangers to him, though none had ever shown interest in listening. Usually they came seeking sound bites, quick quotes about patriotism or parades, not the truth that weighed on his heart. Still, there was something different about her tone. She wasn't rushing, wasn't smiling politely just to leave. She seemed to be waiting, as if the choice to open the door belonged entirely to him. Reluctantly, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said, his voice rough but steady. They sat at his kitchen table, the late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds. Sarah explained that she was working on a feature about forgotten veterans, those whose stories never made it into the history books, whose names were missing from ceremonies and speeches. She had heard about Frank at the Veterans Hall. People had dismissed him, but instead of laughter, his words had left her with questions. "Most people waved it off," she admitted. "But when you spoke about missions that never appeared in the records, I wondered, what if you're right?" For the first time in years, Frank felt the urge to retrieve the old box from the basement. He set it gently on the table, opened it, and slid the worn diary across to her. Sarah handled it with care, flipping through the pages as if she understood the weight of every line. Hours passed as she copied notes, asked questions, and compared his accounts with timelines she had already studied. At first, she suspected it was simply the fragile memory of an aging veteran. But the deeper she looked, the less certain she became. The dates in Frank's diary lined up perfectly with known operations, except there were gaps, places where the official record seemed too neat, too polished. The next week, Sarah returned with files she had dug up from recently declassified archives. They were redacted in places, black lines striking through entire paragraphs. But even with the missing text, she saw it. Inconsistencies, omissions, the absence of missions that Frank had described in detail. She looked up from the papers, her brow furrowed. "Mr. Miller, these documents don't add up. It's as if someone went out of their way to erase an entire operation." Frank's hands shook slightly as he adjusted his glasses. For decades, he had doubted himself, wondering if silence had been his own burden to carry. Now, in Sarah's determined expression, he saw confirmation that he had not imagined it. Sarah closed the diary and leaned forward. Her voice was steady, carrying a promise. "Frank, you have a chance to prove the truth. We'll uncover everything." Together, in that moment, something shifted inside him. The loneliness, Ulani, the ridicule, the years of being unheard, all of it gave way to a fragile but undeniable spark of hope. For the first time in decades, Frank believed that his voice could still matter. Months passed, each one filled with late nights, endless phone calls, and stacks of documents spread across Sarah Collins' small office. Piece by piece, the fragments of Frank's story came together. I'm Onsi. Witnesses confirmed names he had written in his diary. Old memos hinted at missions that never officially happened. And finally, after weeks of persistence, Sarah uncovered the document that tied it all together. A heavily redacted report acknowledging an operation in the jungle, the very one Frank had described. It had ended in tragedy. Dozens of men lost, not because of Frank or his comrades, but due to flawed orders from above. The mission had been buried, erased to avoid shame. The soldiers who lived it had been forced into silence, their sacrifices denied. When the article was published, it spread like wildfire. Newspapers carried headlines about the forgotten mission. Television anchors spoke of long-suppressed files. Veterans across the country reached out, some recognizing the names, others remembering whispers of the same event. What had been hidden in shadows was now open for the world to see. For Frank, the impact was immediate. Letters arrived in his mailbox. Strangers stopped him on the street, not to dismiss him, but to thank him. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of his truth lifting. He was no longer a lone voice. He was part of a chorus demanding recognition. Then came the invitation. The same Veterans Hall where his words had once been drowned in laughter asked him to return, not to be silenced, but to be honored. On the evening of the ceremony, Frank walked slowly into the hall, his cane tapping against the polished floor. The room was full, the air charged with anticipation. Faces turned toward him, not mocking this time, but respectful. Young soldiers stood in crisp uniforms. Older veterans straightened in their chairs, and families filled the back rows. Sarah was there too, standing quietly by the wall, watching as Frank took his place at the podium. He hesitated for a moment, gazing out at the crowd. Only months earlier, these same walls had echoed with doubt and laughter. Now they carried silence, the kind born of attention and respect. Frank cleared his throat, his voice steady though his hands trembled slightly. For a long time, I thought my story was gone. I thought the men I served with would be forgotten. But the truth has a way of finding light. Applause rippled through the room, but Frank lifted a hand, asking for quiet. His gaze softened as he looked from one face to another. We all deserve to be remembered, not because we were perfect, but because we are part of history. The room erupted in a standing ovation. Young soldiers stepped forward to shake his hand, their eyes filled with gratitude. Older veterans embraced him, some with tears in their eyes. In that moment, the years of silence, ridicule, and pain gave way to something greater: recognition, dignity, and hope. As Frank left the hall that night, the cool air of the Ohio evening wrapped around him. The burden he had carried for so long was lighter. His story and the story of his brothers was no longer hidden. It had become part of history, where it always belonged. For the audience, the journey closed not with sorrow, but with inspiration, a reminder that even after decades, truth can rise, and justice, however delayed, can still prevail.